Why we love the Tang Dynasty. Exploring the unique charm of what's seen by many as the greatest imperial dynasty in Chinese history. Episode 3. How the Tang Dynasty was run. I'm Bob Jones, and in this podcast series we'll be getting to know the Tang Dynasty and attempting to discover how, at its height, it became possibly the most powerful, interconnected and innovative country in the world, with a rich and influential legacy that survives even to this day. Bureaucracy these days has a bad reputation. The word is often used to describe petty decision-making and bean counting. But at this time in Chinese history, bureaucracy was seen as good. Bureaucracy meant rule from the centre, by bureaucrats chosen for their intellectual abilities. Many were sent out to become governors of the local regions, where they put down, or at least restrained the power of the local lords. Their quiet scholarly efficiency were a much better bargain for the peasant masses than the local landlords. Early on, Emperor Taizong of Tang had signalled that there was no room for an oversized and expensive bureaucracy. His administration needed to be effective and run like a finely tuned engine. Every official had to pull their own weight, each was part of a cog in a big system. During his reign, he created a highly effective administrative structure with territory divided into what were known as Dao, Zhou and Xian. Altogether, the empire was divided into 10 political districts called Dao. As it grew, that number was expanded to 15. Smaller subordinate districts or prefectures were called Zhou or Fu. Below that was Xian or county. There were other layers, each getting smaller in size, right down to village level. Anyhow, you get the gist. This was a structure for control, a hierarchy. Interestingly, such terms as Zhou and Xian are still used in administration in China today. So, with this framework in place, you needed a civil service to run it. Officials were likewise organised into a structure with 3 departments and 6 ministries at the top. Each level had their own leadership and officials, a civil service. Crucially, there was a direct line of control and responsibility, with the emperor pulling the strings at the top, but perhaps not in the autocratic way that you might think. Let's look more closely at the 3 departments, which actually are not that different from the way things are in the US or the EU or the UK today, with a division of power between the legislative, the judiciary and the executive. The Imperial Secretariat was charged with formulating policy and drafting decrees, usually at the behest of the emperor. The Chancellery existed to advise the emperor and Imperial Secretariat. It checked over the decrees to make sure that they were legal. Once decrees were approved, they were enacted by the Department of State Affairs, which was in charge of the 6 ministries. Essentially, it was regarded as a perfect system of checks and balances, and run by clever people. It held the power of the emperor in check and made sure he stayed within the law. But wait, where do the 6 ministries come in? They had the job of putting the laws and decrees into practice in their areas of competence, namely personnel, finance, rights, military, justice and public works. Such was the success of this super-efficient system of government that it outlived the fall of the Tang Dynasty in 907 and became a model for all the dynasties that followed, and was even used by neighbouring countries and kingdoms such as Vietnam and Korea. Emperor Taizong borrowed this remarkable three-department system from the Sui dynasty, the dynasty before the Tang, but he was the one who perfected it and earned it respect. The system strengthened the role of the state, worked as a check on the powers of the emperor, and weakened the military and regional generals. Essentially, though, the emperor always had the final call. But it all shows that emperors were enlightened enough to realize that sometimes even they could make mistakes. Come with me, I want to show you something. Let's picture the scene at court, which we can do thanks to our friends, the artists of the period. There's one particular painting called The 24 Loyal Ministers of the Tang Dynasty Emperor Taizong, which was painted in 643, which guides our imagination towards the well-chosen group of talented ministers who advised the emperor. Their existence, in a way, showed how the emperor was awake to the feelings and well-being of his people. If you're looking for a parallel today, they'd have been the governors, representatives, and other government officials advising the President of the United States. So, with this amazing administrative machine, it must all have been plain sailing. Well, not always. There was that time in the early years of Emperor Taizong's rule when he wanted to lower the army draft age from 20 to 16. However, one outspoken official rejected each and every version of the emperor's proposal. Not a wise move if you wanted career progression, you might think, but that was not so. The official's name was Wei Zheng. He argued that lowering the army draft age would deplete the country's military reserve and leave the country vulnerable in a future crisis. The emperor listened carefully to his arguments and was eventually convinced, and so he withdrew his proposal. Although theoretically the emperor had the supreme power, he believed it was important to listen to the advice of his subordinates. After all, the empire was simply too big for one man to govern, so the emperor needed the loyalty of his officials and advisors, along with their combined wisdom, in order to run the country. Wei Zheng became one of Emperor Taizong's most trusted advisors, who were known as remonstrative officials. His duty was to make suggestions and correct the monarch's faults. Clearly a dangerous job, especially as Wei Zheng had been advisor to Taizong's scheming eldest brother, and at one point had recommended his brother have him killed. Emperor Taizong once asked Wei Zheng why he had suggested such a course of action. Wei Zheng replied honestly that the late prince should have listened to his advice. If he had done so, then he would have been alive and emperor by now. On another notable occasion, the emperor believed he should pay homage at a religious site. Wei Zheng opposed the move. Taizong protested, listing his many achievements, bringing peace, crushing barbarians, good harvests, etc. Wei Zheng replied, "Even though your Imperial Majesty has accomplished these achievements, we are still inheriting the state left after the Great Confusion at the end of Sui rule. The population is greatly reduced and has not recovered. The food stores are still empty. When your Imperial Majesty heads east, the thousands of horses and wagons require supplies everywhere they go, and it is difficult for the local government to supply them." And he went on and on and on. Now, that's an imperial slapdown. When his trusted counsellor Wei Zheng eventually died, Emperor Taizong suspended court for 5 days to mourn his demise. He also compared Wei Zheng to a mirror that reflected the emperor's achievements and faults. There are 2 important factors which help make this Tang imperial administration system a success, which we'll discuss in detail in a later podcast. One was the system of imperial exams, based on Confucian studies, which became the only way to get a job in government. Their aim was to root out the cleverest and most able people and give them official jobs. The other crucial element was the rule of law. Taizong codified the legal system, set fixed penalties for transgression, and gave it a greater sense of fairness. It would seem common sense never to offend an emperor's authority, but Emperor Taizong was in a class of his own. He was willing to listen to dissenting voices. He was always restrained, even though he had all the power in the world. It was that enlightened attitude which made him and the Tang Dynasty great. Special thanks go out to San Lian Zhongdu for their help in creating the content for this show. This is Bob Jones. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time.